I want to thank you all so much for staying with us this afternoon and tell you a little bit about why we're here and what's going on. So I first want to thank the Critical Race Initiative. I want to thank Dr. Rayshawn Ray for inviting us to be a part of the day's events. So this segment is brought to you in part by AdHum, which is the African American Digital Humanities Initiative here on campus. AdHum is a joint venture with the College of Arts and Humanities Center for Synergy and the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, affectionately referred to as MITH. And the idea behind AdHum is that with the generous support of the Mellon Foundation, we come together to try to create new pathways, new inroads for scholarship at the intersection of African American culture and history and the digital humanities. And in so doing, we've been fortunate to be able to host various training sessions across campus, to bring together scholars in reading group sessions, to bring scholars to campus to speak with us. And we're beginning to take that work outside of the University of Maryland as well, working with community groups, working with the new Smithsonian Museum, working at Howard University, in order to make sure that the extent and reach of scholarship at that intersection is felt not only here on the campus of the University of Maryland, but across the country. There are very rich and important questions for us to ask that change our scholarship in very significant ways, that help us produce better research, that help us think about new questions in new ways when we think about what happens at that intersection. And so what we've been doing this semester is meeting fairly regularly for a reading group session. So in advance of that, we send out our emails, and these are the readings that we're talking about. So we're doing things a little bit differently today because we're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Patricia Hill-Collins and Dean Bonnie Thornton Dill, who are going to join us to talk a little bit more about intersectionality and critical race theory. We want to have that conversation in the larger context of what the goal of the grant is, which is to think about that. What does it mean to take a digital turn in these areas? What does it mean when we begin to think about how scholars are using the work that has been produced on intersectionality, on critical race theory, in ways that were maybe different than we first imagined? What does it mean when we inject intersectionality and critical race theory into conversations about Black digital space, about Black digital humanities? How does it change the kinds of questions we ask, the ways we go about doing our work and doing our analysis, and how we make that information in turn public? How do we take our work outside of the academy so that the communities that we work with, that we work for, have access to it in really productive ways? So I do want to give a very brief introduction of the two panelists that are joining us, as well as other two folks who are on stage with us as well, who are a very important part of our conversation. So Dean Bonnie Thornton Dill is Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities here at the University of Maryland and a professor of women's studies. She's a pioneering scholar studying the intersections of race, class, and gender in the U.S. with an emphasis on African American women, work, and families. Her scholarship has been reprinted in numerous collections and edited volumes. Recent publications include an edited volume of essays on intersectionality with Ruth Zambrana entitled Emerging Intersections, Race, Class, and Gender in Theory, Policy, and Practice, including, and of course, numerous other articles as well. I'm keeping their introductions brief because I assume if you're here, you know why these folks are on the stage with us today. Dr. Patricia Hill-Collins is a social theorist whose research and scholarship have examined issues of race, gender, social class, sexuality, and or nation. Her first book, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, was published in 1990 with revised 10th anniversary edition published in 2000. Won the Jesse Bernard Award of the American Sociological Association for significant scholarship in gender and the C. Wright Mills Award of Study of Social Problems. Her second book, Race, Class, Gender, and Anthology, edited with Margaret Anderson, is widely used as undergraduate courses across the country. Is probably where a lot of us encountered the work for the first time in our undergraduate courses. Many other books and articles and things as well, but we brought both of them together to talk more about issues of intersectionality. A lot of folks have that on the tip of their tongue these days on social media. It's become a term and a word that people are using in classrooms and in public sphere talk a little bit more, and so we want to talk to these folks about how thinking about intersectionality, thinking about critical race theory has changed over the last decade, given the advent of technology. What does that mean for how we're conceptualizing it? Joining us as well is Javon Bickerstaff, who is a postdoctoral associate on the AdHum project, as well as Melissa Brown, who is a graduate student in the Department of Sociology and a graduate assistant on the AdHum project. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Javon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us for this fifth reading group in our session. We've discussed a number of things over the course of this semester, and our central theme is race, space, and place. And so we've had reading group sessions that have dealt with holding space, another session on where and where we enter. We had some time at the Smithsonian last month thinking about the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Blacksonian, right? To think about theorizing the archive. And so we've been thinking about a number of issues over the course of the semester, and there was no way that we could put this together without thinking about intersectionality and critical race theory. And so we're going to kick off the conversation by letting both Dean Dill and Dr. Hill Collins make some remarks about how they see the field at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation part of this, so I'm going to be brief in my own remarks, and really just kind of start a little bit with my own entry, because I really came to this before it was called intersectionality. And I was really interested in issues of social inequality and power, and the ways in which various structures of social inequality combined to create different kinds of opportunities for people. And so in many different ways, what has come to be known as intersectionality still is kind of rooted, for me, really grew out of trying to understand the particular experiences of African American women and the ways and how they sat at the intersection in many ways of various systems of inequality, and how that created opportunities and disadvantages and advantages for them in all aspects of their lives. I think that intersectionality as a term, not just as a term, but really as a mode of analysis, as a way of thinking about inequality. I think it has moved and traveled as much as it has and into many different fields because it really is about those fundamental kinds of questions about inequality. And so many groups have been able to kind of adopt this mode of analysis or this way of thinking or these lenses through which they look at their experience, because the advantage of this was to say that these things were not independent, they were not isolated, they were mutually constitutive of one another. And so part of the expansion and the talk about this term has been, I think, really still, or should be, now that's a whole nother question and we can get into that, about issues. For me, it is fundamentally about issues of power and inequality and how those move across societies, because certainly this term has moved across many different societies in many different ways, how it moves across many different groups of people, and how it is looking at both sides of the coin. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece that I will say, and this is, Patricia Hill Collins is going to say some similar things, but it'll be more elaborate but we started, in many ways we started at the same place, and we still kind of value certain pieces of this. And the other piece of it for me has to do with, because I said it started with lived experiences of African American women, and so it has to do with praxis, I guess that's a way of thinking about it, but it also has to do with how you take this knowledge and this meaning and what it means for helping you understand and interpret the world and then act within it around these ongoing issues. So that's all I want to say by way of kind of a starting place, and then I'll let Dr. Collins speak, and then hopefully we will talk.
It's actually a very good segue. To me, a lot of this work starts in action and then develops knowledge from that action. Asking the question, what is the best course, what is working and what is not, and what is helping it work and what is retarding it working. And around the basic question of social inequality, I would say social justice and equity, some kind of fairness discourse or ethical framework or foundation has always been involved with this work. We don't talk about that enough, I think. So just to say a word or two, because I don't want to just talk forever here, but a couple of years ago, just to remind myself of where I was around your question of where the field has gone, I was really quite despondent. I have been writing for years and years and years and thinking, the audience is there, I don't know where they are, maybe someday, after I'm gone, they'll discover it, somebody will read it, you know, my ancestors. I was kind of in this gloomy place. And I was really ready to wrap it up. And there was a student in my class who said to me, you know, Dr. Collins, you're all over the internet. There's the student right there. Do you know that black feminism is all over the internet? I was totally stunned. What? You're kidding. What? How'd that happen? What seems to be going on now is a new set of conceptual tools to do both activist work and to do intellectual work. And for the first time in ever, I think, to not have significant gatekeeping, keeping those two things apart. So as I look at this whole trajectory of intersectionality, and I would attach that to black feminism, which is quite significant in this particular framework. Intersectionality is not the property of black women or of black feminism, but it's quite central to black women's struggles. And if I look at critical race theory, which in my mind is much broader than the way we currently start the clock. We started in 1990 with critical race theory, and we also start that clock in 1990 of intersectionality, when Crenshaw coins this term. I just say it that way because you want to know that commodification is happening, if everybody says it this way. But these ideas of critical race theory and of black feminism, or whatever that was called in the past, have been there all along as there is racial inequality. As long as there's social inequality, there will be a need for this discourse. So the question of how it operates, or how much of it is visible, or when it's not visible, and the forms that it takes, is an ongoing, to me, sociological question that is endlessly interesting, right? So the fact that I almost gave up on my own question fascinates me, because I didn't see this one coming. I saw media from above, the top-down media, and how it was like those images, and what, if they could just stop doing that, and I was writing the controlling images, and you know, but I didn't see the tools from below in terms of what happens if you give people the power to tell their own story and do their own analysis. And that, to me, is the moment that we're in now that I find really exciting. That is not just American, that is global. That's not just here, it's everywhere I go. There are ways of thinking about things very, very differently because we have these tools. But the challenges are the same. There would be no reason to have intersectionality, to have black feminism, or to even have a critical race that is different than regular race. Because critical race, by the way, is that framework that says racism is wrong, racism has got to go, and the knowledges that uphold it, that racial ideology, that racial, all that stuff that's out there, we have to criticize that and develop alternatives to that. That's critical race theory. And that didn't start with the legal scholars in the 1990s. You can go way back on that one. As long as you have racism, you have somebody saying, oh no, this can't be right. All right, that kind of thing. You want to go to that moment. So this particular period of time around the connections among intersectionality, critical race theory, black feminism, and the possibilities, both for suppression and for, I would use the term liberation, in a digital space, is what I'm learning from you guys. This is why I'm chasing you around and showing up at your stuff all the time. You notice I'm doing this? They don't invite me, but I do show up. No, they do invite me. They're quite welcoming. So I think we've got a lot of issues on the table to talk about here, one of which, to me, would be the real danger of something becomes meaningless because it becomes popular.
Right.
All right, and not mistaking popularity for power. Okay, so yeah, Nicki Minaj is popular, but is she powerful?
Right.
Okay, that kind of thing. She might be. She's kind of powerful. You know, those are the kinds of questions we might need to talk about.
Right.
But at this particular point in time, I think that's a big one. The commodification, I think it's really great if you can work almost labor in without being watched, not being under surveillance, because then you've got the space to be creative in ways that are quite different than if you're trying to calibrate your every word in every situation that you're in, and knowing that it might be archived, and someone will watch it 5 years from now and say, let's lock her up, kind of thing. You know, so I mean, the times that we work in are quite different in terms of the creative process and in terms of the political process, but these are exciting times. So I'm going to stop right there.
So thinking about kind of comments that both of you have made. One of the issues that seems to be central is this issue of theory and practice, theory and action, and never divorcing two, recognizing they're always in this kind of recursive relationship with one another. And so I'm going to be bringing in some of the readings that we did as we have this conversation. In a piece by Kashana Gray, she notes that we have all of this kind of damaging imagery of women of color, and it's pervasive, right? So the kind of controlling images, that notion of it's there, how do we get around it, what do we do with it? But she said it's more than that, it just exists. There's always contestation and resistance and agency within that. And so she notes the way that she sees the pushback, but she is also really attentive to the idea that oppressed populations tend to lack the control needed to fully reframe and reconceptualize their realities. And so the first question I kind of want to throw out there is, in what ways can we see the digital acting in order to allow some of that work to be done? And that is to everyone.
I'm feeling kind of talkative now, finally. The last session, we watched the video formation, and at the Super Bowl, that one. And last week, I visited a class at the University of Cincinnati called Fierce Sociology, studying Beyonce. So I visited one of these classes that is being taught by a colleague of mine there, who's a junior faculty member. 50 students, fascinating, because they use this material, controlling images and all. The course enabled them to not see it as good or bad, or oppressive or liberating, as if the message is actually in what we're looking at. They realized that their interpretation was going to be really significant in how they engage all of these ideas. So it's really kind of what we as educators have been trying to get people to do for quite some time, which is to be critical thinkers. But I was fascinated by the power of the media to get them to that point as quickly as it did. So,
I also think that one of the advantages in the digital space is there's a place for a lot more variety and a lot more reframing of what you see. So the memes that you see, you know, the things on Black Twitter, the way people, I mean, they are able to take some of these things, reframe them, or present counter images. So I think in one way, we have a lot more variety going on. We have a lot more ways of looking at how we can be and what we can be than we have had. And I think when we had, you know, particularly when you talked about the 4 controlling images and all of that kind of thing, I mean, that was pretty much what we were seeing as you were talking about, Pat, from the top down. And we didn't have spaces to kind of reframe those things. And I think that's one of the things that's
what I find fascinating about Beyonce is Beyonce seems to have the ability to draw upon certain controlling images, but to also disrupt them at the same time. Because she brings a sophistication to the space of performance. So I don't necessarily sit there and just say, oh, that's terrible, she's just reinforcing, you know, bad things, or she's really liberated because her girls are out there with boots and with their hands up and the fists at the Super Bowl. It's not that clear cut. It's really, I think, quite sophisticated in terms of how you mess with the norms that say, I know you want to, you want to sexualize me and make money off my body. I totally get that. But I am no victim here, all right? I mean, I'm controlling this for a particular outcome. And I'm going to do one formation for you guys at the Super Bowl and come into the middle of that patriotic space, that national spectacle, and do this. I'm going to disrupt in a way that's like, oh, she didn't really do that, did she? You know what I'm saying? But then I'm going to do a video that does something very different, for which I'm going to catch a whole different kind of criticism. It's really, really interesting, the moment that we're in. So I'm not even remotely close to knowing. That's all I know about Beyonce. I just want to be really clear. I've exhausted my knowledge of Beyonce, all right? So there are other people who you can look at now. But my colleague was telling me there's an entire book about this, full of articles. See how they all done so much.
Syllabi, all that. But what's
You know that
fascinating about the digital too is the ability to draw upon that complexity.
Yeah.
Right? Of the not being positive or negative imagery, of not being good or bad discourse, but the ability to bring complexity into public space so that people can actually see the kind of conversation, sorry about that, people can see the kind of conversation that people have always been having. The Black women's conversation about Black femininity and Black feminism has always been richly complex.
Yes.
Right. We've always been able to dissect images of ourselves and have the kind of conversations that are resistant, that are liberating, and that do allow us pieces of agency in our own conversation about ourselves. What the digital complicates is the ability to make that public in ways that potentially it wasn't before, which brings its own kind of complications and challenges, right? But also for people for whom this is their mode of discourse. This isn't something that is learned. I didn't learn how to write online in the way that I learned how to write for academia. Right? I wrote online from when I was 12. Right? So this is how I learned to write, was in these spaces. And so that adds a layer of complexity to the ability for people to write in ways online that are potentially more connected to how they really want to have discourse than the avenues that they've had before to potentially have these conversations.
So in thinking about what you just said, Catherine, and the way that the digital allows some agency, right? Certainly never
right.
total. In being able to shape, reshape, remix different kinds of narratives. One of the things that I'm interested in always is how do we center Black experience, right? And after we center Black experience, how we theorize from that. And there's a long vernacular history of Black women doing that in their lives, right? Sans label of intersectionality. If we think about the way that people are engaging in spaces, both in the academy and outside of it, what are the limitations, right? Everybody ain't Beyonce, everybody ain't gonna be on the Super Bowl, right? What are the ways that we see that folks are able to make those interventions, but where are also the limitations? And how do we see power, right, acting in that?
Well, one of the things I think about it, because I wanted to go back to this, so it's an opportunity, because Dr. Hill Collins mentioned the issue of surveillance. And I do think that this is an issue in this space. I mean, there's always been surveillance, so let's not say that suddenly, but there is a new kind of surveillance, and I think that that moderates, perhaps. I mean, I think that's one of the constraints, is my answer to your question. I think we need to explore that a little bit more, because the extent to which it moderates kind of what people can share or how they share it, or it can be used against people at later times, you know, or if it's all archived, and we're all about creating archives of these many of these kinds of things. That's right. You know, what are the negatives and the positives? I think those are all questions that, I think that's one of the constraints.
I don't know. I think we're always in a period of new opportunities and new constraints. And I think this is one of the core ideas of intersection, to me, a core idea of its complexity, is you can have two and three and four things going on at the same time. All right, so it's both and. It's not either or, good or bad. So when I think about the period of time we're in now, I have a pretty good sense of how to think about surveillance, all right, in terms of protecting yourself about that. But there's a whole nother way of looking at the surveillance. I was at a dissertation hearing yesterday, wonderful dissertation out of journalism on Black Lives Matter and citizen journalists. And that one, she used the expression surveillance, all right, which you've heard of. See, I learned from this dissertation, which is looking at the world from the bottom, all right, or looking at the world from, you're the one that technically is being watched, but you're watching back in a certain way. And because you're watching back in that particular way, you have a whole nother, more sophisticated understanding of the world that you're in. And I think that claiming that space, as opposed to feeling bad about the fact that you're on the bottom, or they're looking at you, or you know, whatever, they're going to micromanage you, but also realizing the power of knowledge from that particular space means that they often don't see you coming, because you're perpetually underestimated. You know, it's like, no way, anything's going to happen by that poor downtrodden, whoever that person is. But that's a site, to me, of power that can be claimed with the digital much more easily now. in terms of one's voice going further and connecting with other people. So this whole notion of surveillance from the top, surveillance from the bottom as a power relationship that we're in, and thinking about any knowledge or ideas that we create as being embedded in that power relationship, to me creates new constraints, but new opportunities for those who recognize it as such.
I don't disagree with that, but I think the surveillance may be a new term, but I think that's not new.
I don't think it's new at all.
In other words, the ability of the downtrodden to kind of have a perspective on the elites, and then to raise questions and challenge out of that perspective and not be seen, not necessarily
Right. It
be
makes me think
anticipated.
of
as
Dr. Khan's book when she talked about black women working as domestics. And so
Absolutely.
they had that positionality where typically for black men, because they were excluded from white spaces, they weren't able to kind of cultivate the knowledge that black women then use and carry back to their communities to be subversive.
We talk about the possibilities then of writing online for black women. To be a black woman is to know what everyone thinks of you, right? It's to always be cognizantly, to be aware of how the world views you and to shape your responses accordingly, right?
Or control the agenda.
Or conversely
whole-
then have the
yeah.
power to then do that,
That's what's
right? And so
happening now.
that's what I think is fascinating
Yeah.
about this space then, is that
Right.
the ability to connect back outward, right? And to know who is watching and the reason behind their watching, and then to understand then how to write back for this community or to write out of the sight of that community when it's useful. These are specific skill sets that are not acquired later in life, but rather a part of survival from the beginning, right? So the idea of surveillance, right, is, as you said, it's not new. It's intrinsically a part of what it means to be a marginalized person, is to understand from the perspective of others who you are and how they see you and where they see you and what that means for your life.
Exactly.
And in that same regard, I don't think intersectionality is new. I mean, the whole notion of, and again, we're talking about black women because I think this is quite central to all of this that we're talking about today. But knowing that you are oppressed, things are not going well in your life, how can you get it to be better? How can you get more money? Why did your child die because you couldn't get health care? I mean, all the kind of social issues that are social problems that black women have faced historically, and then asking yourself the question, is that just race? No. Is that gender? Well, of course it's about gender because I can't get health care for my child. Is it race and gender? What is that? We're poor. Why are we poor? Why are all the black people poor and the other people aren't poor like we are? So there's always been this implicit analysis that is intersectional that certain black feminist intellectuals have brought to the forefront because they've been able to articulate it. But they certainly didn't articulate it by saying, I think I'm going to sit down and write this trendy new thing called intersectionality that maybe someday in 2017 people will have conferences about, woo, woo, woo. You know, I mean, that's not the way it came about. It's very much embedded in the organic, your initial comment, Javon, the organic experiences of how to make sense of your own environment, how to put together an argument that makes sense that will empower you. Other than that, why would there be a black feminism? Why would this even, there's no need, right? So it's a very different way of thinking about the world than we have to go to school and everybody teaches us all this stuff, whether it's formal writing or whether it's formal theory or feminist theory or critical race theory or sociology or whatever it is.
One of the
Or
things,
arts and humanities.
Or arts and humanities.
definitely. One of the things that all of you touched on is there's a kind of situational nature of power and agency, right? It's not wholesale, it's not monolithic. And so if we're thinking about the ways that folks from the bottom are able to engage in the digital in order to shape their narratives, in order to push back, in order to keep some things out of sight, how do we also understand the fact that a lot of the platforms that they use are not owned by them, right? And so how do we deal with the kind of corporate nature of things? Because even as we're using these things often in really subversive ways, there are also problems when Facebook decides that it's going to shut down certain things because people are protesting, or it's going to give certain information in certain places. And so how do we operate through that? And Melissa, I was thinking about your work in particular because I know that you came to some of your research thinking about how we talk about the digital divide, like that being the thing that Black and oppressed people as a whole were seen as in terms of the digital. And you're like, no, but we use that
Yeah.
space in really different ways.
Exactly. So what started my research question was Black Lives Matter, and I found it to be a really interesting tipping point because I remember when I was an undergrad, we had, I guess, our Black Lives Matter moment with Troy Davis, and I remember it was in the years that Twitter had just been a major platform, and I remember distinctly Black undergraduate students across the United States turning to Twitter and strategizing ways to intervene with the state of Georgia regarding the execution of Troy Davis. So I came into grad student kind of with that moment really poignant for me because I had never seen something like that before. I had never seen young people mobilized like that. I think like coming out of the public school system at that time, especially in Georgia, our idea of activism is strictly about the civil rights movement. And so we were given this impression that to be an activist was to be a certain type of body with a certain type of status, so a form of respectability politics in particular. So with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw that 3 Black queer women initiated a movement around Trayvon Martin that continued to grow in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri because of the death of Mike Brown. And so what that ended up doing was, okay, these tools that we don't know why the CEO of Twitter created Twitter. We can surmise, though, that he didn't intend for Black Lives Matter to be kind of one of the pivotal things. I think to this day, Black Lives Matter is one of the most hashtag things ever coming out of Twitter. And so that really said to me, okay, you know, all I know from the sociological standpoint is the digital divide, but if there was such a strong digital divide, how is it possible that Black Lives Matter is what it is? That's when I started to research further. I think it was Rayshawn who pointed me in the direction that actually mobile technology has been widely adopted by Black and Latino groups. And so the advent of Web 2.0 then has created a completely different narrative about Black digital agency. And I do think, though, that we still have to think about the fact that that agency is constrained by who owns the tools. So I think, for instance, Very Smart Brothers developing their own platform to tell Black stories, to discuss Black culture, is probably the direction that many of us need to continue to go to. But it's not brand new for Black people to take technologies and alter their purpose and turn them into something subversive, regardless of what the intention of the entity that created that technology was. And so I think that even though those constraints exist, Black people are always a way to examine how people are going to thwart those constraints and do things with technology that we didn't initially think that they were going to do.
If we think a bit further about the ways that folks are using technology, we are also in a particular institution ourselves, right? And we engage with that work in really particular ways. And so we can think about surveillance from above, but there's also the fact that we engage with people's work in really particular ways. We collect tweets, we analyze things. And so thinking about this as scholars, how do you see the ethics, right, of engaging in the way that the digital is being used right now? Being mindful of kind of the call of intersectionality is be attentive to power and recognizing that we inhabit multiple spaces within that power structure.
I'll say that in November, I had a moment of thinking about what my work did to make visible spaces that were not meant to be visible. And haven't fully reconciled that completely. I think if I had, it would be problematic for my scholarship, because if that's not a continuous question that I ask myself every time I spend time in a blogging community, every time I engage on Twitter, then that would be deeply problematic as a scholar. To not be thinking about what the implications of my work are for the people that I'm talking with and to and about. Does that mean that I no longer want to publish work about Black folks online? No, I do, right? And I do for many reasons. One, because of the liberatory potential of making visible how people organize and create space and find joy and all those things that I think need to be a part of our academic discourse. But I will say that if we aren't, as scholars, continuously thinking about what the implications are of our work in these times and outside of these times generally, then we're doing not only ourselves a disservice, we're doing a disservice to the folks that we're working with and for. But that doesn't mean that we can't still do the work well. And it doesn't mean that folks haven't been thinking about these things for quite a long time. The ethics of doing work in communities of color, of doing work with marginalized populations, there's some transferable knowledge to digital spaces that we can gather and take with us if we're so inclined. There's also a lot of folks who have been doing work on digital platforms that are not about people of color, and there's some transferable knowledge that we should take. And I think the problem is that oftentimes these conversations happen separately.
Right.
So we have folks who have been working with folks of color for years in various fields, and we have the internet folks. And there's knowledge banks there, and we have to draw upon the knowledge that each one is bringing and not pretend that we're doing these things in vacuums. And I think that's helpful for us having these more productive conversations about ethics online.
I also think that when doing the research, I'm reflective of Chimamanda Adichie's statement about the danger of a single story.
Yes.
So for instance, when I think about the scholarship that's been published on Black Lives Matter, one of the things that's always constantly iterated is the idea that these 3 Black queer women started this movement. But one of the things that I found through my research was that the Ferguson activists actually consider themselves to be distinct from the Black Lives Matter movement and feel that that particular narrative erased their labor, right? And so another thing that goes on too with that is because of the media having such a strong narrative. So for instance, as soon as Black Lives Matter became a thing, the media started discussing all lives matter as the pushback. Well, I did the study on the research of, I think, 31 million tweets about Ferguson, and all lives matter wasn't crucial to that narrative. So you ask yourself, well, where did that come from? Where did the idea of all lives matter come from if it wasn't from that digital space? And so doing that research, I think the most important thing for me is to realize that there are so many narratives and so many entities making narratives and so many entities with different degrees of power making narrative. My responsibility as a Black digital scholar is to remember the lens from which I'm coming and make sure that I'm speaking to that perspective and not erasing voices and doing the same things that more dominant people would do.
I think the ethics are always going to be complicated. And I'll just say a little bit about what it was like to write Black feminist thought and some of the subsequent criticisms that came from the Academy, which is interesting. Because in writing that particular book, I was an assistant professor. I had just gotten promoted. I was an associate professor, so I was feeling quite full of myself. But even with that, I felt that I had to handle the material carefully because I wanted to write a book that would speak to Black women about the lived experiences of their lives. And I was pretty familiar with the heterogeneity of Black women's lives, but had to make felt I had to make then strategic choices to help create the space for Black women to be able to even say anything. So it was really treading very carefully in terms of how do you talk to your main audience, knowing that you're talking to a bigger audience that can come back and micromanage your main audience, or talking to a broader white audience in a way that goes right through them so that the Black audience would understand what you said and what you meant. It was really similar to how the earlier panel talked about this film in terms of knowing all the Black references, and why it's, what makes it a white film or a Black film. It's kind of like that. So really the sophistication of asking how much of this story can you tell, and then being accused years later by a young Asian woman, actually, when I spent a semester at the University of Michigan, who said, Dr. Collins, what would you say about the fact that your book is essentialist and stereotypes Black women? And I'm thinking, this is from people who don't even know any Black women, but they know how to sort of, do a critique that basically will challenge something that they find threatening in one way or another. So it's really interesting, the ethics of our work, in terms of how much we can say and what we say and why we're saying it, and just sometimes having to go home with the private story of, why you did and did not do certain things. And that's what really matters. It's not the external eye. Now that's then. Now what's different is I think the gatekeeping has been so weakened, all right? So that you can talk directly to the people you want to talk to. You don't have to wait for them to get into school and then pay tuition and then sit in a certain classroom and then be able to read you don't have to do all of that. It's much more immediate, but that means there's also much more of the possibility for fatal error.
That's right. Right.
I write books. It takes me forever to write a book. I'm not kidding, forever. So I can come back and say, that word's not right. Take that out, bad idea.
Right.
You know, I can really do that. But when you're in this immediate digital, speeded up, compressed kind of space-time thing that we're in now, I think it's much harder.
Oh, yes.
It's not harder, it's different.
It takes me back too to a point I made earlier just about the multiplicity of narratives that are there. Because I think, and I was glad you talked about kind of these ethical questions as ongoing, and that Pat, you talked about because I was thinking about in my own work as a qualitative researcher and kind of gathering people's stories and then trying to tell those stories. What do you tell? When are you airing your dirty laundry? When are you, how will people use what you tell?
That's it too.
And how do you do this in a way that is both respectful, but also talks about problems and doesn't try to kind of create, and so I think part of the advantage is that there are all of these multiple narratives and there are all of these multiple stories, and so you don't kind of, I mean, it's always complex, and those are always issues you're going to have to deal with, and it's never going to be perfectly clear, and you're just going to do your best and hope, you know, and try to be, I think, back to the issues of social justice that you talked about, try to keep all of those things in mind, but also know that yours is not the only story out there. And hopefully that makes space for many other stories that are
But it
contradictory.
also creates the problem of that there are many stories out there.
Yep.
And,
Right.
you know, and I mean, I for one am tired of all these little stories. You know, I mean, at some point, I mean, how many times do you want to hear the same? It's sort of a different. Wait a minute, how do I even know you're making sense? Particularly if it's not. I don't know much about digital. I have to find you all to like who are credible and say whatever she said, I agree with that. You know? But I mean, but it's sort of the same kind of who do you trust?
Right.
It's a trust issue in terms of who do you consider sort of the best source. And that's really what we need to work on in terms of how do we analyze this stuff. It's the critical thinking skills again. Because now I think we've got great material. And a lot of it may get worked out in conversation. I think that's how a lot of it does get worked out. But I don't know if that's quite enough. So I'm just raising an issue I don't know the answer to.
That makes me think, and I'm going to ask a question, but there's a circle to get to it. In thinking about the ways that we do grapple with this material, right? And the fact that it's not only that we take a lot of time as academics to write our work, collecting the work, right? If you're doing interviews, I'm a qualitative researcher as well, it takes a certain amount of time. The speed at which things happen in the digital world means that where you started out the question, they might have left that and moved so far on. And so how do we think about the kind of work that we do in this Web 2.0 environment, right? Which is even different in some ways than, Catherine, even when you started just looking at blogs, the way things happen on Twitter is just, you know how I feel about the tweeting and the Twitter. But it happens so quickly. And one of the clips, you know, that we were talking about was this amplification effect that happens. And sometimes that leads us astray in certain things, but as analysts, as researchers, how do we grapple with that speed when our work tends not to work? And go at that speed.
The first thing is that we have to write in ways that are responsive to what's happening, but are not predicated on them being published right now and only for right now. So I write about things that are current. They're not current by the time they come out in press sometimes, but the focus is not the content, right? So it doesn't actually matter that it was Beyonce making an X on the field, right? The points, the analysis, the theory lives on, right? It's not for that moment. And I feel like if we're writing about Black Lives Matter as though it exists by itself and it's not a part of a trajectory and there's nothing before or after it and it's not connected to anything, that's not good work, right? To your point about what good digital scholarship looks like. Good scholarship about media generally, I could write about an article about MySpace right now that should still be relevant.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, not relevant because you're using MySpace, I hope. I don't think.
I thought that was gone, right?
You can still access my, yeah.
Well,
Not because you're using my space,
Right.
but because there are things that happened in that space that are indicative of the time in which they happened, that say something about the people that interacted with it, that say something about the technology and our use of technology and our grappling with it, that should resonate over the long period. I should still be able to write about radio. I should still be able to write about newspaper, right? And so I can still write about, somebody was like, you still write about blogs? How cute, how quaint, right? Like you haven't moved on to the newest thing yet? I'm like, but yes, I still write about blogs because there's still things about blogs that we need to interrogate and think about, and they're still relevant and they're still important. And so we shouldn't get so sidetracked as digital scholars about wanting to make sure that we get the thing out about the technology before it moves on, because if that's the case, then what you're writing is probably not that interesting, actually. Right? It's
So
probably not that useful.
Would you say you're actually writing history differently?
Yeah.
You're not waiting for it to be over.
We're
You're
writing it
actually
now.
writing
Yeah,
it now with
absolutely.
the expectation that if you're doing a good job and you're contextualizing it and you have big questions and I would say theoretical concerns, that whenever it comes out, it will be read that way.
That's right.
Or it can be positioned in the times
That's
that
the
you're
hope.
in.
That's the
That's
hope.
it?
Yeah.
Well, I'm
trying.
hopeful. I didn't think anybody would be reading my stuff now. I'm totally shocked by this.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I'm gonna get it right.
But I think your work points to Catherine's point about the idea that regardless of how quickly the digital moves, there are certain things that are like seminal pieces that connect the narrative. I think I really like about the Black feminist digital space, right, is that Dr. Collins' book is pretty much pivotal to getting into that conversation. The type of narrative or dialogue that you have with these women across time and space is relevant because he wrote that book, right? So even before the
book-
digital happened.
Yeah, the book was an invitation.
Right,
It
and-
wasn't designed to be the
Exactly.
Bible.
Yeah.
And if people read it as the Bible, or if they read it as definitive, or they want to argue with me
Right.
about it, that's not the point. The point is inviting people into a conversation that's ongoing that you may not have realized you're part of. And I think good
that
scholarship does that.
And I think that the Twitter users who discuss Black feminism in particular are aware of that it is a dialogue and a conversation and are having it in that way, really have a nuanced discussion. So I think, like, you know, when Catherine then comes and publishes an article about blogs, because of that foundation of literature, it's something that gets included and added and gives nuance to the conversation. Instead of being, like you said, this idea of we have to respond quickly, I think that because people know that there's a legacy of this literature, the anticipation is that Catherine's going to be responding to Collins, even though it's, you know, 20 years
And my
later.
expectation is that you all are writing a new foundation for this moment.
That's true,
All right, so there'll be some little girl out there, a little boy who's not even born, all right, little transgendered person, all right, who's not even here yet, who will be saying, I'm reading the foundational work from this particular period of time, and they were writing during a period of time when a lot was going on, and they couldn't really see clearly where it was going to go.
Right.
But what they wanted to do was have an intervention, and perhaps thinking, I can shape where it might go, even if I don't see it go there. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy duty, you know, you know, everybody hear that? That's really, can you like get that together?
I'm trying.
We're working on it.
Working on it, that's all you can.
one of the things that we've been talking about on the AdHum team over the course of this whole project is how do we center Black experience, and not just center the experience, right, but how do we theorize from that experience? And so one of the things that I've been talking about, and at some point Catherine is going to make me write this paper, is how do we theorize beyond the gaze, riffing on Toni Morrison, right? How do we write beyond the gaze? How do we theorize beyond the gaze by centering Black experience? And so Dr. Hill Collins and Dean Dill, I'd love for you to talk about the ways that you center Black experience in your work, and then as digital scholars, I also want us to think about what does it mean to center Black experience in the digital, especially because the way that the digital is conceived in the academy is often the same way that digital gaming happens. It's a white teenage boy, it's a white thing that happens, and we know that's not the case. And so how do we center Black experience, and how does that shape how we theorize?
Well, you know, one of the things I think that's helpful to remember is that much of this conversation about Black feminist scholarship, about intersections of various, came out of centering Black women's experience in the context of feminist dialogue and scholarship. Okay. So, and it suggested that it was not just a unique experience or that you could just kind of add it into your traditional ways of thinking about feminism, but that once you did take this seriously, you had to rethink feminist theory. And that it could not be, you could not talk about women as a single category. Now, I mean, that's kind of a historical argument in a way, but I see it as very similar set of issues. In other words, and we can talk about that also not just in the context of feminism, but in the context of race studies and gender. And really moving us to a place where there is more consciousness about these varieties of experiences and the need to think about when and where and how they come together.
All right, so let me just build on that a little bit. For me, my assumption is when I went to school, I'm the first person in my family to attend college. All right, so I'm kind of like it in a lot of ways. And what was obvious to me in going to college and going to school was that most Black women did not have the opportunities that I had. So that meant that they were not going to be educated. They were not going to be experiencing discussions about racial theory or gender. It just wasn't going to happen that way. And I either had to think about, and it was clear to me, the ways in which my college and university, however well-meaning, it was really very liberal school, was simply missing the point, right, in a lot of ways. They just didn't seem to ever, there was something there that they didn't know what to do, right? So the whole notion of starting from Black women's experiences, in this case, it could be anybody's experience, you know, but starting from Black women's experiences involved sort of creating a space, this is how I describe it, creating a space that makes your own intellectual work possible. You can't just wander around in these places and assume they're going to give you everything you want, to say whatever you want, any kind of way you want. That's actually a very playful and immature way of doing intellectual work. And I'm not going to say any more about who gets to do that kind of work and who doesn't. You can just fill in the blanks, all right? So it was more a question of saying, what are the crucial lived experiences that Black women have and that they are articulating in the context of their everyday lives? And that they do not need an anthropologist to come in and help them see it.
Exactly.
They do not, I mean, you just, what is it, right? So, and that when I started working that way and asking, this isn't just an idiosyncratic way of thinking about experience. It's not narcissistic like my experience, oh my goodness, no. It was actually very altruistic in terms of having to think about experiences that were not yours, but that were really affecting yours, but you're connected to this group, you know, the whole category of group, and then the list of things that show up is quite standard. Health, housing, I mean, a really wonderful list of social issues in sociology, but experienced differently, depending on what kind of Black woman you're talking about. And I think that's had its influence. How we study things is very different than how people experience, live them, and think about it. So to me, the question of bringing things into closer alignment and thinking in a much more complex way about what experience means. The American pragmatists have a very good understanding of experience. I'm going back to their work pretty recently, because they don't think of it as just my individual lived experience that I can kind of talk from. They really talk about it as creating a collective reality from those experiences. So there's some theoretical traditions that really can help us also think about experience, much more than just what you get. Experience is my opinion, you know, sort of in the popular press.
In a practical way of responding of what does it mean to centralize Black thought? What does it mean for you as a scholar to do that? What does it mean for you as a writer to do that? I remember when I was first pitching my dissertation idea to someone who I thought was going to be on my committee, and wanted to talk about Black folks, right? That was what I wanted to do, and I wanted to talk about Black folks' experiences online and how they were creating community and were they creating community, was this distinct? And the response was, that would probably be more interesting if you contrasted it with how Eastern Europeans experience community online, so you could see how different populations who are immigrants experienced it. I was like, it was great meeting with you. I don't think you're going to be on my committee. But that is the practical response, right? And what it meant to centralize Blackness for me was that there were folks that weren't going to respect the work I was doing at the time, weren't going to see it as valuable. I had to prove its value. To just talk about Black people by themselves was enough, right? That there did not have to be and we're okay because see how we compare to, right? That did not have to be a part of the argument in order for it to be valid, important work. That talking about our legacies, our oral histories, that was really enough on its own. And so part of centralizing Blackness in your work is making decisions about who's down the road, who's going to read it, how they're going to read it, how they're going to see you in your scholarship, and being okay with that. Not only being okay with it, embracing it, being passionate about it, seeing it as valuable by yourself if others don't, and getting them to the place of seeing its value as well. So I think that there are real practical decisions that you make in graduate school, in your undergraduate studies, about what you're going to write about and what you think is central and what's important that really have implications for your trajectory. But that was one for me, right? It was a moment of, I'm going to be okay just writing about Black folks. Like, I'm really going to be okay in that it's going to mean certain things for the kinds of jobs. It's worked out all right. It's going to mean certain things for the kinds of jobs and the kind of places that are going to see my value, but it's going to mean other places aren't, and I'm going to be okay with that.
Right.
I've always been I'm going to now talk about Black feminist thought a little bit here, because to me the question was to not write a book that already cited I'm going to just say white people and everybody can just deal with it that way, all right? But that just was simply not going to regurgitate the existing canon and then add in a few Black women who were Black women worthies. That's that whole comparative thing. So what I decided to do was, and this is all work I had read. I was completely familiar with the canon. All right, I just decided not to cite it.
Yes.
All right, I mean, I cited really strategically to let people know, oh, she knows this stuff. So it's not just a Black book kind of thing. But made sure I was turning over every single rock, nook, and cranny. I was citing anonymous Black women. Anonymous. The people who really had never even had an opportunity to be named in relationship to their work and their ideas. So that was quite challenging. And I just thought, okay, let's just see how this goes. One conference I went to, a very prominent feminist stood up and said to me, white feminist, she says, I was just reading your book and your book on your chapter on sexual politics. Why you don't have all of the work on reproductive work and this, that, blah, blah, blah. She was citing all of this long list of people who were the woman worthies in the field. And I said, well, I'm certainly aware of them, but I chose not to. But the silence. She didn't know what to make of that. I mean, that was mysterious to her. But because I really felt I had nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Once I got tenure, that's what I wanted. So if you don't like me, fine. You can not like me at this point. But but we're always making these kind of. Sometimes it could be a little micro dig.
That's right.
That's right. It can be something small, or it can be like the big splash. But the whole notion of just really being very clear about who the work is for and why you're doing it, and it's not just for one group. It's not the property of one group, but it's for something bigger, right?
I think it also helped me to know that the pushback that I received isn't the first. So I think about like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alden Morris's book explaining how he was marginalized from the academy. And I think it was Marcus Hunter who describes Black scholars today kind of reclaiming that heritage as a form of intellectual reparations. And so for me, that's definitely what this is about, right? Like I'm not trying to be here nearly a century or more after Du Bois did his work and continue to be erased. Like I'm going to have to do more than the intellectual ancestors before me did or were even allowed to do in order to intentionally center my work on Black experiences.
But do you think you're going to have to identify what the core questions are that you're picking up? See, those are the political dynamics you're describing that surround the work, but the whole notion of keeping the eye on, on sparrow. Keep your eye on where you want to go with this. What are those core questions that have been disrupted, that have been distracted, that have been muted, that have been, we've run off in the wrong direction? I mean, that to me is really the challenge of also reading the times that we're in around doing this kind of work.
Definitely.
And up to a point, something like intersectionality is really helpful, and then in other ways it's not.
Yeah.
Right? So beginning to think through that in terms of what those questions are.
Right.
I think that's one of the things that in my own scholarship, I've definitely had to grapple with, right? I study Black couples. Everybody knows I study Black people. I will only study Black people. I study Black. But I don't necessarily study Blackness, right? And so in centering Black couples, that same kind of pushback. So where's the comparison? How are you going to situate this? It means that, and I'm saying this to the young scholars in the room, you make some choices. And you are going to do some work that's going to be intellectually challenging in a way that your colleagues might not, right? Because in order for me to do that, it meant that I had to be really strategic about the literature in which I situated my work. I don't talk about the Black family. I don't talk about the kind of work family literature, the way that it gets talked about. I don't talk about the demography work of how are Black men and women finding one another or failing to find one another, and somebody like you ain't never getting married, Javon, right? Like, I don't deal with any of those things, but I know all of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's in knowing all of it that I was able to choose a different literature. I situated in the sociology of emotions because that allows me to have some leeway, some latitude, some freedoms.
But push it even further, because I think what you can say is, what makes you think you can't get to the universal through the particulars of Blackness?
I think you
Because that's-
can.
I certainly think you can, but that's the essence of racism. That's the essence of when you talked about this morning, the dehumanization, all of that. Well, how could we possibly get to anything that's totally human going through Black people? That's how I hear that.
Yep.
And
So, I mean, I don't say that often, but that is often how
Right.
I've heard it.
And I think one of the things you see, particularly if you look at literature and the arts, it is those things that are created out of a particular experience that have a broad impact because they've gotten to the universal. And there is no reason why you cannot do that with good social science research or research in other domains.
Would you tell Toni Morrison, why don't you have more white people in your books?
She would have a response.
Yes,
clearly.
I'm sure somebody has tried to do
Right?
it, but I mean, would you tell her that around Beloved? I mean, what would you say about these
Right.
kinds of
Or
things? You don't do
compare.
that with the arts.
No, I mean, she makes the statement that, look, Tolstoy wasn't thinking about me
Yeah.
when he was writing. And so I think
Right.
that there's a way that, as scholars, though, we're going to get that pushback, right, of assuming that you can't theorize about the universal. And so I always say, people are like, oh, you study Black couples, you study Black love. No, I study love.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, this, we take this back to the digital, and I think some of the best work on thinking about platform use, thinking about privacy and ethics and all of these are coming from Black digital scholars who are talking about Black people, but not necessarily talking about Blackness sometimes, right? So when I say, if you want to understand how a platform can be used to its fullest potential, you've got to look at how Black folks are using it.
Absolutely.
Right, and so when I study blogs, I mean, I've had pushback from editors who said, well, you're talking about how Black people use the internet, and you're talking about the mechanisms by which Black people can do this. I'm like, well, somebody else could maybe learn from them and do it that way too. But what I'm talking about is how people who have traditionally not had access have always made the most with the least of what they've had.
Yes.
And so because that is the Black experience, it is that Black experience as it relates to technology and communication as well. So if we look at the communicative prowess of Black folks, then we learn what the possibilities of communication is writ large. When we look at the technological prowess of Black folks, then we understand how people generally can use spaces that weren't designed for them to do things that they weren't designed to do. And so it's fascinating to me, the idea that my work is only about, I mean, yes, I'm very intricately aware that I focus exclusively on Black spaces online, but I do that in a way, hopefully, that people get to see what the possibilities then are. Because we've had to do things a certain way, and because we've had to, we've excelled, right? And we have made Black excellent.
So I'm going to pose one more question for our conversation, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have your questions, be thinking about them, get ready, line up, do all the things. In terms of thinking about the way that our research gets received and evaluated and judged, right? One of the things that happens, that we know that happens, is if you're doing research that begins with Black folks, and you're coming from an intersectional approach that believes always in theory and praxis, but always being attentive to power and social inequality. That issue of social justice and the work that gets done around that is not going to be valued by the academy. I think that there's a parallel often in the kind of work that we produce digitally. Clearly, we're privileged here, right? It is very respected in a way here in the university, but still even in our departments, right? That kind of work that we do as scholars that extends into different arenas, that seeks to do more than just talk to the people in the discipline. How do we do that in ways that create more opportunities, not just for us, right, but to break down some of those barriers for those folks who are going to come after us?
Okay, this sounds like a senior scholar kind of question.
I was waiting.
I was just going to wait and lay
This
it
sounds
there.
like a dean kind of question, too. Because it's a collective effort, is my response. You know, I mean, there are interventions on all levels of your career, from undergrad, if it's going to be academic work, all the way through senior scholar, through administrative positions. And I think the issue is just to be focused on excellence. And to continue to think that standards of excellence that were developed for what was excellent 50, 100 years ago, that was fine. But it's not 50 or 100 years ago. I mean, and to really sort of begin to think outside of the box in how we evaluate things. Now, the danger, not the danger, but the real constraints now is that we have to evaluate everything. Oh, I sneezed yesterday. Can you give me a point value on that? You know, or whatever it is. So in some ways, we have all this trivial, constant auditing of everything, where you can't tell the good from the bad, with really taking the time and sit and say, if we're really going to evaluate excellence, and excellence may look very different than it did 25, 30 years ago. Certainly the people look different, so one would think the excellence would look different. Or the tools that we're using are different now because we've got digital tools. One might think, you know, we would evaluate impact differently. All right, you know, all of that, I think in a thoughtful way, perhaps influenced by professional associations that can influence the standards in particular fields, or administrators who really can, you know, who are visionary and see where things are going, as opposed to, you know, let's circle the wagons and just make sure we protect that old excellence from these people who are bringing it down. Those are political issues. But unless you have a sense of it's a long-term, that's what long-term struggle is. All right, so there's no victory. It's more like
Always forward.
it's always forward, but always what do you have to work with at any given point in time? You do the best you can, but if you exhaust yourself, you're not good to anybody.
Yes.
I think I think about this question with my dean hat on, but as the dean of a College of Arts and Humanities, and it seems increasingly clear that the future in these areas of study cannot remain within the academy. We cannot just talk to our colleagues and have 5 people read our articles. And I think that's not just limited to the arts and humanities. I think it is broader. It's the challenge in a way that higher education is facing, because people have to see why this matters. What difference does it make? What value does it have? And so we have to be able to speak about what we do and why we do it in ways that can connect to people's needs and can connect to kind of what's going on in the world. So that in many ways, I think that, you know, now the train is moving slowly, too slowly in some ways. Some parts of it haven't left the station yet. But I think that, but if it doesn't leave the station, the station's going to close and it's going to be left behind.
Exactly.
And I think that is kind of the cultural pressure in a way. And I think if you know that, you can also take advantage of that as you try to move your own work forward.
I'll just say, I think that I find myself in a fortunate position to have a dean who is supportive of digital scholarship writ large, right? So Dean Dill is the PI for the AdHum initiative, right? The amount of investment that our university is making in digital practice, digital scholarship, digital theory, right, is not what everybody's doing. So we should be aware of that. Right. But it's incumbent upon all of us, as you said, in the positions that we're in, to advance that ball even further, right? So what does it mean as a junior faculty? It means encouraging students who want to do dissertations that have a digital chapter hey, let's push it together. Let's make some folks uncomfortable, but let's make sure that we can do this together, right? That might be my limited position right here, right? But there's somebody who's gonna look at my tenure case. So there's folks at different, and we work from where we are to say, how do we advance this to the next place where we start to have standards still, right, of excellence, and that we're all able to understand what those standards of excellence are, and how do we use the tools we have to make that more clear, make that more transparent so that people know what the expectations are, just like they would for traditional publications, right? So we can do this. We can apply these same mechanisms to make sure that we're not just, oh, you published, you sneezed, and you wrote about it, and that's great, right? So there can be standards, but we have to be intentional about it, right? And it means that from all of us working from the position of power that we find ourselves in, the position of privilege that we're in, advancing the ball how we can, right? And I feel very fortunate that I'm in a place where that's the train has left the station, right? At least at University of
You're
Maryland.
on the front end.
So we have a few minutes, I believe, for some questions. The microphone is in the middle. And just give us a sense when you come up to the mic of who you are, what discipline.
I'm Sherry Parks. I'm faculty in American Studies. I'm Associate Dean in RHU and co-PI on AdHum. It's really not a question. For this audience, I wanted to call attention, if you're interested in this topic, to Mary Helen Washington's essay when she was president of the American Studies Association in 1997, disturbing the piece. It's online. Disturbing the piece, what happens to American studies if you put African American studies at the center. It was her presidential address. And then you will see that some ASA and American Studies have actually addressed these questions in many ways and made some changes. And I would also suggest, and I was surprised that you didn't say this, AdHum is itself an intervention into the academy.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you write grants to people on the outside who are willing to listen to you, and then, they didn't come to us and say, this is what we want you to make. They, Bonnie started a conversation, they went, oh, okay, keep talking.
Yeah.
And so that is itself an intervention.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
So you don't have to respond.
Hi, my name is Jocelyn. I'm a government and politics major here at the University of Maryland. Yesterday, hi. Oh yeah, she did my interview for my scholarship program. So I was
Microphone. Microphone.
So yesterday, last night, I did a thread regarding PTSD for sexual assault because there's a lot of women of color that struggle with it, especially with the with one of the symptoms being the fact that you might be hypersexual, where everybody thinks you'll refrain from sex. And a lot of people started DMing me and texting me, being like, I really respect the fact that you did this thread, and I went through it myself. But when one of my friends, who's a black woman, tries to do it, people aren't receptive of it. If anything, they'll be like, they'll try to kind of say like she's hypersexual because that's just the way that she is, and use the words hoe, the hoe slut. And then when I went to Howard University, I was trying to see how they were feeling in terms of this, and they were like, well, it's a method, branding is really big in our community, so you trying to be open about your sexuality is not going to be something that's taken into account. So with this wave of feminism, where do black women fall under it?
I think Melissa's work is very connected to this.
So I think that's a really good question, right? So I think when I hear what you were talking about, because the interesting space about, I guess, being black women on Twitter is, right, like you're not alone. You're being surveilled by various groups, and when you're being surveilled by the groups, they come to you with these controlling images, much of them which are rooted in hypersexualization. So I think the interesting thing about it, though, is that even though many of the constraints remain the same, the innovative thing for black women in this moment of feminism is to be able to articulate that, one, mainstream feminism was never for them, right? Because if that was the case, I think it was, I want to say, third wave feminism that was supposed to be about sexual liberation, right? So if this whole sexual liberation thing had worked for black women, then when you did your thread, they wouldn't have gotten the pushback that they got. That doesn't seem to be the case. So black women are always trying to articulate their own space, especially around their sexuality. So one of the things that I want to study, for instance, is the ways that black women, exotic dancers, use Instagram to market themselves and brand themselves and push back against the idea that they are, as you said, hoes and sluts, right? And so one of the ways that I try to conceive of that idea is when we reflect on the Great Migration era. During that era, the blues woman was a working class black woman who was heavily regulated, and her sexuality was highly policed because there was this idea that, once again, she was hypersexual. Single black women were moving from the south to the north, and one of the ways that their sexuality was policed through was through reformers. So black and white women reformers claiming to come from a feminist stance looked at these blues women who were working as sex workers and prostitutes and numbers runners and various things that were considered vice. And these blues women, though, pushed back against that. They said, actually, as black women, we can own our sexuality, we can speak sexually, we can be sexually explicit, and we can have a full identity that includes our sexuality. So in this modern era, when we look at black women erotic dancers, I say that they are the hip hop version of the blues women. The easiest way to label them then is the bad bitch, right? And so I think that black women are capable of pushing back against that notion, coming up with ideas. It's like, oh, you say that I'm a bitch because I speak for myself. Well, actually, I'm a bad bitch. And now that becomes something that becomes mainstream. Like one of my professors, Don Down, pointed out how, I think it was Ronda Rousey, who now identifies herself as a bad bitch. And so what that means then is that black women, even if we're being erased at some level in the conversation, we're still embedded in it, and we're actually contributing on a major level, even as we get erased, right? So I think that the major issue then is, how do we use digital tools to make sure that black women don't get erased, right? Like, how do we use digital tools to make sure that the identity, sexuality, and performativeness of black women exotic dancers that becomes mainstream doesn't get disembodied from the area which it came from, and those women continue to get policed while everyone else gets to benefit from the sexual liberation that they taught us. So I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that black women are always going to be innovative in pushing back against these controlling narratives and continuing to develop ways to identify themselves regardless of how society sees them.
At the same time,